Genshin Impact feels friendly to beginners and can be beaten with a bare minimum of understanding due to its forgiving nature and shallow learning curve. However, it has a surprising amount of depth, and people often become overwhelmed once they try to get a deeper understanding. In this video, I'll outline some general tips I often find myself giving to people who ask for help in my community. I'm also working on a series of videos which explain each of these points and more in detail, so make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. First, a couple of pieces of advice on how I approach the game in general. Once you start looking beyond the surface of Genshin, you should expect to be confused. Genshin throws a lot of information at you, with pages and pages of sometimes awkwardly worded text, which can be very hard to follow. It's rare for new players to absorb all of this information, and common for people to feel overwhelmed and out of their depth. However, the difficulty level of the game is forgiving, and you should be able to beat most of the content with only the most basic understanding of the game's mechanics. It's perfectly valid to breeze through the game, mashing buttons and enjoying the ride. Try not to let the lack of clarity get in the way of your enjoyment of the game. And if you'd like to learn a little more, you're in the right place. Which leads me to my second tip. There are corners of the Genshin community where everyone loves to help people figure this game out. That's the purpose of this series of videos, and also, if you ever have any questions, please leave a comment down below or join my Twitch streams and ask for guidance. I'll happily help you. We spend many a fun afternoon roaming around people's worlds in co-op to help them level up their characters when they find things are getting a little too tough, or chatting through any issues people are having and sharing knowledge. As a late game player, this is some of the most fun I have in the game, and there are a lot of people who feel the same way. Next, some general advice around combat. Don't expect elements to work like they do in Pokémon. For a lot of people, Pokémon's elements feel like the default way of elemental powers in games to work. In those games, each element has strengths and weaknesses to other elements, which can be easily understood by looking at a chart for a couple of seconds. Grass is weak to fire, fire is weak to water, water is weak to grass, and so on. It feels like most of the games take a similar approach to this, including ones which predate Pokémon, so it's common to assume that Genshin's elemental-based battle system works like this. However, while it does start from a similar place, Genshin's elemental system is much more interesting than that. When you use an elemental attack, it applies that element to the enemy. Hit them with water and they'll become wet. Hit them with cryo and they'll become cold. That part is simple enough, but what happens next is where the fun begins. When you apply another element to an enemy who already has an elemental status, the two elements react with each other and cause a unique effect. For example, let's say we've made an enemy wet. If we hit them with pyro, it vaporizes their wet status and the attack does more damage. If we hit them with cryo instead, it freezes them in place. And that's just the surface level. Genshin's elemental system is satisfying to play with once you understand the basics, and has hidden depths which can be even more rewarding to explore. Make sure you use Freeze Elemental Reaction early on. Freeze is extremely powerful because it prevents enemies from doing anything, which is particularly useful when going up against tougher enemies which do a lot of damage. I remember being intimidated by Ruin Guards early on because they could kill me with ease. The first time I tried fighting them with Freeze Team was a moment of revelation. These powerful and difficult enemies instantly became a breeze to destroy, all their power made impotent by their inability to move. Everyone gets Kaya and Barbara for free, so it's definitely worth at least trying them out to see if you like their playstyle. It's worth noting that there are enemies who are immune to freezing, like bosses, so this is not a technique that works against all enemies. Don't judge how much you like playing a character based on their normal attacks alone. People often ask me for advice on which characters are worth building, and my answer is always that they're all potentially great, so what matters most is who you enjoy playing with and how they fit into your potential teams. The problem with that advice is that people often judge characters based on their normal attacks in basic main attacker role, even when that doesn't play into the character's strengths. This is an understandable reaction. Early on, your characters will recharge their energy slower, so you won't be able to use elemental bursts very often. You also won't have much stamina, so you can only do a couple of charged attacks before running out. As a result, any characters who are designed for you to focus on their burst or their charged attacks will feel very different early on to how they will later on. For example, many people dislike attacking with bow characters. If that's you, you will probably not enjoy Ganyu's charged attack playstyle no matter how much you invest into her. However, you should not let that cloud your perception of Fischl or Diona, because both of them are designed to be primarily used for their skill and burst and almost never for their charged attacks. Unfortunately, this makes it hard to plan for the long term early on. The best way to get around this is to ask more experienced players what role your character is intended for and how they feel later on in game. Next, some general advice about what to do and what not to do. Do the events whenever possible. Genshin runs a steady stream of time-limited events with every version, with a wide variety of gameplay styles, difficulty levels, and rewards. Some are short and sweet, while others can be expansive and explore deeper backstory and lore. They are a great source of primogems for wishing, and Mora, Wit, and so on for leveling your characters. I recently started a second account so I could re-experience the early game to get a better perspective for these videos. And while my intent was to take it easy and enjoy the story, I ended up speeding through some of the early quests just to unlock one of the recent events. The reason for this is that the event in question offered one of the limited edition event weapons, which are only available as a reward for completing one specific event. At the risk of causing preemptive FOMO for you, it's always worth prioritizing events whenever possible, because those rewards are gone forever if you miss them. That said, please don't stress about it or sacrifice enjoyment just to complete an event in time. No reward is irreplaceable, they're simply very valuable, especially for free-to-play accounts. Use your original resin, save your fragile resin. This number up here in the corner is called Original Resin. It's like an energy bar for your account, and you use it to redeem rewards after defeating bosses or doing other things in game. It's the main way Genshin puts a cap on progress. It recharges over time, and there's a max limit of 160. You should try and spend your Original Resin every day. This item in the inventory is called Fragile Resin. When you consume one, it turns into 60 Original Resin, which you can then spend. This item has only a limited availability in the game, so it's a good idea to save it until you're past AR45, since you get more rewards per fragile resin at that point. You'll often see people recommend saving your resin until later. This is what they're talking about. I'll talk about resin in more detail in another video, so for now just remember to spend your original resin and save your fragile resin. Pick up everything. When you're wandering around the world, you'll often see sparkles letting you know that there's some item to pick up. This happens so often that people tend to learn to ignore them fairly quickly, since it's not clear whether any given item will be useful in the future. The truth is that pretty much everything you can pick up will be useful at some point for leveling up one character or another, and your future self will thank you profusely if you get into the habit of picking up anything which is at least vaguely within reach. Do the domain which teaches you elemental reactions. This domain in Mondstadt is one which becomes available very early on, but which is fairly easy to skip if you don't want to do it. First time around, I was a bit intimidated by domains, so I skipped it when it unlocked, and I completely forgot about it until later on in the game. While it's not brilliant at teaching you the finer details of various elemental reactions in the game, it's better than nothing, and it's probably something that every beginner should take the time to do. If you have a decent grasp on the reactions already, then it's an easy domain to beat, and if not, it should give enough of an overview that you can get a better handle on what more in-depth guides are talking about. One thing which trips up a lot of people early on is the Character Trials tab in the Events menu. People see the word trials and assume it's some kind of a difficult challenge for you to attempt. That couldn't be further from the truth. This feature is actually where you get to try out the special characters on the current banner. When you start one of the trials, you're sent to a domain filled with mostly hilichurls and slimes and given a set team of pre-built characters, which can be a useful way to see whether you like the feel of the new character. Unfortunately, the trials are very limited, since the enemies you face and the teams you use aren't necessarily a good representation of how a character would feel in the game for real. Regardless, it's always worth taking 5 to 10 minutes to do all the character trials for each banner, since you get a small number of primogems plus some level up materials as a reward. Be careful about spending your billets. Billets are items which you can use to create craftable weapons, and they are ridiculously rare. One of each type can be obtained from a couple of shops, and a couple more of each type are available from the sacred trees later on in game. The only other source of billets is weekly bosses, which have 12% chance of dropping a random billet. Early on my main account, I used my billets carelessly to craft all kinds of weapons, thinking I'd get more billets later on, and despite doing all available weekly bosses every week, no new billets dropped for weeks at a time. It wasn't until I had very little need for the craftable weapons anymore that bosses started dropping billets for me again. On the other hand, the best of the craftable weapons are usually slightly less powerful than the 4-star weapons you can obtain from the gacha system, so billets are arguably much less useful later on than they are in early game. It's one of those things where at first you wish you had them, but by the time you get them, you no longer need them. My main advice here is to be careful, do some research, and ask for advice before spending them, but ultimately do go ahead and spend them once you've found a weapon which would be useful for your favorite characters in the long run. And finally, my most important piece of advice: have fun. Try not to feel pressure to do everything or to play the game the right way, and instead experiment, find the parts that you like the most and enjoy them. Too many people get caught up in the subculture that says the only way to win at Genshin is to chase ever higher damage numbers like your life depends on it, even if the grind this requires ends up driving them up the wall. It doesn't have to be this way. Genshin can be an idyllic escape from the real world if you let it be.